Two sisters stood on the same rooftop, 6 days apart, and made the same heartbreaking decision to jump. One broken by a night of unimaginable violence, the other consumed by guilt. Their deaths weren't the end of the story. They were the beginning of a family's downfall, a mother's relentless battle for justice, and a dark truth buried by an indifferent system. What really happened that led an entire family to unravel? This is the tragic story of the Yang sisters from Korea. August 28, 2009, 8:18 p.m. A woman stands on the edge of a rooftop, the wind tangling her hair as she looks down at the sprawling city below. The distant hum of traffic mixes with the muffled sounds of a television playing in a nearby apartment. Her fingers tremble as she grips the railing, her breath uneven. In this moment, time seems to slow. Then, without a sound, she lets go. September 3rd, 2009. On the rooftop of the same building, another woman stands, tears streaming down her face as she clutches a photograph. The photo flaps violently in the wind before slipping through her fingers, carried away into the night. With one last sob, she closes her eyes and follows her sister's path. Two sisters, two tragic leaps, only 6 days apart. The question hanging in the air, haunting their family and everyone who hears their story. Why? How desperate must they have been to die together? Their mother, Mrs. Chang, is the only one left to tell the story, and after years of silence, she finally does. The nightmare didn't start with their deaths. It began years earlier, creeping into their lives like a shadow that wouldn't let go. In 2004, Yang Sora, the eldest daughter, was 30 years old and in graduate school. She spent her days buried in books and thesis drafts, working diligently on her future. She was smart, disciplined, and optimistic, a woman with dreams and everything ahead of her. Her younger sister, Yang Sojong, was 26 and had dreams of her own, though hers revolved around the bright lights of the entertainment industry. She was a backup dancer for singers and had plenty of connections in the business. One day, she heard about a part-time gig for extras on a film set. It sounded easy, fun even. Without a second thought, she recommended it to her older sister, Sora. But what seemed like an ordinary job turned into the beginning of their nightmare. After the part-time job, Sora wasn't the same. At first, it was small things, silence at dinner, a distant gaze, but soon, things spiraled. Sora began wandering the house naked, tearing up papers and muttering curses, die, die, like she was possessed by something she couldn't control. Her mother watched in horror as the daughter she once knew slipped away before her eyes. Then came the violence. Sora lashed out at her mother and younger sister, turning their home into a battlefield of fear and confusion. Desperate, they called the police, who took Sora away and admitted her to a psychiatric hospital. It was there in the sterile walls of the hospital that the terrible truth finally came out. Sora, trembling and crying, confided in her doctor and her mother. The words spilled out one after another as she described the day she worked as an extra. After the filming ended, there was a wrap-up party. Everyone was drinking and laughing, and the man in charge of the extras, referred to as A, was there too. He handed Sora a drink, insisting over and over despite her protests. Sora wasn't a drinker. She knew her body couldn't handle alcohol, but A wouldn't take no for an answer. She gave in, taking a sip, and that sip was all it took. The room blurred, her head spun, her legs gave out. She was too intoxicated to stand, let alone think straight. But that was exactly what A wanted. Pretending to help her, he led her out of the party. "You just need some fresh air," he said. But instead of fresh air, he took her to a nearby video room, where his demeanor changed completely. Gone was the friendly manager. In his place stood a predator. He pinned her down. Sora fought to stay awake, to resist, but she was too weak, and A didn't stop. She fought back as hard as she could. Her mind was spinning, her limbs felt heavy, but she kept struggling, desperate to escape. But A leaned in closer, his breath hot and suffocating. He wasn't just overpowering her physically, he knew how to break her spirit. "I will burn you with a lighter," he whispered, waving it in front of her face. "I will cut you with a knife." His voice was calm, cold, and terrifying. Sora froze. Her body stopped fighting even though her mind was screaming. The fear took over, paralyzing her, and that is when he sexually assaulted her. Her world shattered that night, but the nightmare didn't end there. After A was finished, he called for others. One by one, they came. 12 men in total, taking turns violating her, each one leaving another scar she could never erase. The next morning, Sora wanted to report them. She wanted justice. But how do you fight 12 monsters when you're just one person, drowning in fear and humiliation? The thought of standing in front of the world, naming her attackers, reliving every excruciating second, she couldn't do it. The fear silenced her, and the silence broke her. Her mother, Mrs. Chang, wasn't willing to stay silent. She filed a lawsuit against the men who destroyed her daughter's life. But what came next was more shocking than anyone could have imagined. For 1 year and 8 months, the investigation dragged on like a slow, painful punishment. Sora's life became an endless loop of police interviews, questions, and reminders of her trauma. Then, just when they thought they might be making progress, the case was closed. The police said there wasn't enough evidence. To make it worse, Sora herself had withdrawn the charges. At first, people couldn't understand why, until they heard the heartbreaking reason. Sora couldn't take it anymore. The investigation was like ripping open her wounds every day. She had to retell the details of the assault over and over again when the police dragged their feet. She lost hope that the truth would ever come out. And the way the police treated her, that was just as devastating as the crime itself. They didn't see her as a victim. They treated her like a liar. If you were really dragged into the motel room, why didn't you scream for help? What proof do you have that they raped you? Why didn't you fight harder when they touched your chest? Why didn't you scream or push them away? Every question was like a knife, carving away at her dignity. Then it was revealed that during the investigation, Sora had to give her testimony in a room separated from the perpetrators by only a thin partition. She could hear their voices, their laughter, as she described in painful detail the night they destroyed her life. The very men who raped her were just feet away, listening. The police didn't protect her. They exposed her to the same monsters she was trying to escape. And then there was Mr. B, the head of the agency's branch, who casually confirmed the horrific truth. The team leader picks girls he likes and does things to them. This isn't the first time, it's just how things work. But that statement didn't lead to mass arrests, no. The agency fired 4 men, and that was it. No prison sentences, no public outrage. Just 4 dismissals as if they'd been caught stealing office supplies instead of raping an innocent woman. In an interview, Mrs. Chang recounted her daughter's downward spiral after the investigation. One day, after a police interview, Sora ran out into traffic, trying to throw herself onto an 8-lane road. She just couldn't take it anymore. During the interviews, they made her describe the rape in detail, while the voices of the perpetrators were in the next room. They even made her mimic the sounds and moans from that night. Mrs. Chang said, "Not every sexual assault victim ends themselves, but I believe the police killed my daughters." Mrs. Chang's words laid bare the harsh truth. It wasn't just the perpetrators who destroyed Sora. The system had a hand in her death too. This wasn't just speculation. Sora's psychiatric treatment records back it up. Her psychiatrist wrote, May 17, 2005, she cried for 3 days after giving her statement. She felt trapped because everything depended on her testimony alone. November 21, 2005, there's still half of her statement left, but seeing the perpetrator's face is unbearable. Their voices haunt her, and memories of being locked in the car and threatened cause constant anxiety and nightmares. The records show what Mrs. Chang had been saying all along. Sora was haunted not just by the attack, but the investigation that followed. Despite the trauma, Sora tried to move on. She enrolled in a real estate course, joined a craft workshop, and took a part-time job at a chicken restaurant. She was clawing her way back to life, one day at a time. But her wounds were too deep. The world she had once lived in felt like a distant memory, and no amount of effort could pull her back. In the end, the weight of her trauma proved too much for Yang Sora. On August 28, 2009, at 8:18 p.m., she climbed to the 18th floor of an apartment building in Seodaemungu, Seoul. The city lights flickered below as she stood at the edge. No one was there to stop her. And with one final step, she let herself fall into the night. And 6 days later, her younger sister, Yang Sojong, stood on the same rooftop, clutching her guilt like a vice around her chest. She couldn't forgive herself for introducing her sister to that part-time job, the job that destroyed her. In a final cry for justice no one seemed willing to give, she followed her sister into the dark, leaving their family shattered beyond repair. Their father didn't last long after that. Overcome with grief, he suffered a brain hemorrhage and passed away. The only one left was their mother, Mrs. Chang, now a widow with nothing but memories of her family's suffering. But Mrs. Chang wasn't ready to let her daughter's stories die. In 2014, she filed a civil lawsuit against the 12 men who had assaulted Sora, determined to expose their crimes. But justice was nowhere in sight. The lawsuit was dismissed because the 3-year statute of limitations for civil cases had long expired. By the time she had gathered the strength and resources to take legal action, 9 years and 6 months had passed since the assault. With the courts shutting her out, Mrs. Chang took to public protests. She staged one-person demonstrations outside the entertainment agency that had arranged the extras for the shoot. But instead of sympathy, she faced retaliation. The perpetrators sued her for defamation. The prosecution even brought her to trial. But the court, recognizing the tragedy and systemic failure, ruled in her favor. The judge, in a rare moment of compassion, said, "We cannot overlook the tragic failure of public authorities and the immense suffering this mother and her daughters endured. It fills us with deep sorrow and despair." It was a small victory, one that came with no real consequences for the men who had destroyed her family. They were still free, walking among ordinary people, while her family had been torn apart beyond repair. By December 2019, Mrs. Chang had nothing left to lose. She took her fight to the internet. Through her YouTube channel, she uploaded the names, faces, and personal information of the 12 perpetrators. She revealed their current names, some of whom had legally changed them, and even their places of residence. On December 23, 2019, she had uploaded her anger and heartbreak immortalized in a video for the world to see. To this day, in 2025, that video is still there, still calling for justice. Legally, it's considered a violation of privacy laws, but Mrs. Chang wasn't afraid. What more could they take from her when she had already lost everything? In April 2020, she staged another one-person protest, this time outside the Cheolsan police station in Gwangmyeong. It was here that Officer Cho, the same officer who had pressured Sora to withdraw her complaint all those years ago, was now stationed. But during the protest, a heated argument broke out between Mrs. Chang and Officer Zhou, escalating into a physical altercation. Both of them ended up filing assault charges against each other. And just a few months later, in August 2020, more unsettling news surfaced. Some of the men who had assaulted Sora were still working in the entertainment industry as managers for extras. They hadn't been punished. They hadn't even been driven out of the industry. Once this came to light, NBC Plus terminated its contracts with the perpetrators, and CJ Entertainment followed, cutting ties and claiming they hadn't known the men were connected to the Yang sisters case. But this wasn't enough to erase the years they had already spent working in the same industry that had enabled their crimes. The truth had been staring everyone in the face for years. In 2013, nearly 10 years after the assault, it was revealed that 7 of the 12 perpetrators were still working in the industry. According to the Hangyeol newspaper, they held positions as executives or team leaders at various entertainment companies. They were thriving while the Yang family lay buried under tragedy. On October 22, 2020, a spiritual ceremony was held in front of MBC's headquarters. This was meant to console the souls of the victims, Sora, Sojong, and the others whose lives had been destroyed. But there was no consolation for the fact that 16 years had passed, and the case remained unresolved. The system had failed, and no one had been held accountable. Now in 2025, 21 years since the assault, Mrs. Chang's voice still echoes on her YouTube channel. Her pleas for justice remain unanswered. Her daughters remain buried, and not a single one of the 12 perpetrators has faced punishment. The least we can do is remember. Yang Sora and Yang Sojong's deaths weren't inevitable. They were preventable. They were failed by a system that dismissed their pain, by police who re-traumatized rather than protected, and by an industry that allowed perpetrators to thrive. Their suffering wasn't just at the hands of their abusers, but in the silence and indifference that followed. No victim should be forced to relive their trauma, humiliated by degrading questions, or exposed to their attackers during investigations. No young woman should fear pursuing her dreams because predators lurk unchecked in positions of power. And no grieving mother should be left alone to fight a battle that society should have fought with her. This case must stay with us, not as just another tragic story, but as a reminder of what needs to change. We need legal systems that listen and protect, industries that hold abusers accountable, and a society that believes survivors without demanding perfection from them. By refusing to forget Sora and Sojong, we honor their suffering. But honoring them isn't enough. We owe them action. We owe them change. We owe them a world where no one else falls through the same cracks, where no other family is destroyed by the silence we allowed. Let their story fuel that change, because remembering them is just the beginning. That is all for today. Thanks for watching.